steal some of it.
He
rob
did.
his own storage container. and
He
back in
continues
jail.
to lead a rather troubled life.
Did he
So,
get back in jail?
Yeah.
Oh,
He got out this year.
yeah, he was paroled. It
paroled.
was recent. So, all right, without falling down the hole and talking about OJ all period, let's get to PACLA versus Connecticut, because what you've seen is a whole progression of cases that say yes incorporation, yes incorporation. It seems like we're on our way to total incorporation, and then hit the brakes here. What we're going to get to here is selective incorporation. So you have a case where there's an individual charged with first and second degree murder. They have when you charge somebody, you put a whole bunch of charges against them and hope as many of them as possible stick, I suppose. So he's charged with, in particular, first degree murder of two Connecticut police officers, but they failed to meet the burden of proof on that charge, and instead he gets convicted of second degree murder. A lesser charge, carrying a lesser penalty. You know, the trigger here, though, is, the murder of police officers. And this is obviously something that the state feels very strongly about. This verdict is troubling to them, so they go after him a second time on first degree murder charges. What sounds to be being violated in this case? Double jeopardy, right? In Powell, we talked about, well, you're acquitted, you're not, the verdict is overturned, you're not acquitted. In this case, I mean, really, this is a more clear-cut violation of double jeopardy. You know, the whole idea of how many bites of the apple do you get, right? I didn't get my conviction, let me try it again until I get the verdict I want. That's obviously kind of an abuse of powers. So we're going to look at the idea of, is this a violation of double jeopardy? We're going to look to see, again, follow the complex language, does the 14th Amendment's right to due process, and you know, again, states are not supposed to be able to prohibit that right, it obligates states to uphold the Fifth Amendment's guarantee against double jeopardy. Okay, and if so, was this a violation of double jeopardy? Okay, so seems pretty slam dunk, right? I didn't get the verdict I want. I'm going to come at you again, try to get that first degree verdict. And all along, we've been saying yes, yes, yes.
So the frame of this just means it's not going to be what it should be.
Right. So what they say is, we're not going to bind the states to the Fifth Amendment guarantee against double jeopardy. Why? Because we only have to really obligate the states to the rights that are fundamental. And a protection against double jeopardy in a state trial is not fundamental. Does that make any sense? Yeah. All right, it doesn't really have to.
Great.
You know, again, it has to do with the composition of the courts and a character of the courts at this point that really wants to uphold law and order. Again, I think there's kind of a pendulum where, you know, would we rather let 1,000 guilty people go free rather than wrongfully convict one innocent person? That's irrevocable. You can't give back time. You certainly can't, undo the mental trauma. You certainly can't, if you've deprived someone of life, give that back. But there are points where the court feels like we're being too lenient on the accused. The Rehnquist court that we'll study later as we finish up this unit will be an example of that. So that's kind of where they are. They're looking to uphold law and order. The good news is, we're at selective incorporation. We've kind of come up with this bizarre standard that only the rights implicit to ordered liberty need to be upheld. And eventually the court will get to where it should. It does seem like in the aggregate they arrive to where they should. They will reverse this decision in a case called Benton versus Maryland, where they'll say, of course, the protection against double jeopardy applies. Still today, though, some rights don't apply. Chief among them, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, in a well-regulated militia. Why? Well, in part, I think it's to give, when you see a right not incorporated, in some cases, I think because maybe we haven't arrived at a consensus with this right, what does it exactly mean? And we don't necessarily want to obligate states to an unclear standard. States act as a laboratory. Let them kind of meet local needs. If, for example, though, a really, strict gun measure was passed, and you did get a challenge, this could be your next incorporation case, where, you know, for example, Massachusetts has some of the most stringent laws out there, but that's kind of consistent with the constituency. Most people in Massachusetts, even if they're hunters, I think, favor and are okay with the gun laws that we have. If you take a state that is more pro-gun and you force a more restrictive measure, you might get a challenge there. And you might say, wait a minute, I have this federal guarantee to a right to bear arms, and I think the standard includes assault weapons. And then we've got to kind of figure out what that right means and apply it to the states kind of more universally. In the case of quartering troops, I suppose because it's arcane. And that's why we don't, there's no case, because there hasn't been a soldier coming and, you know, knocking on your door saying, you got room. And again, remember, that wasn't in private homes anyways. That was, you know, you just had to kind of put them up in public accommodations. With the 5th and with the 7th, you know, this is about grand juries and a right to kind of a jury trial. Essentially, those are expensive, and these are cost-saving maneuvers, not to kind of obligate states to these expensive kind of jury trials. And then the idea of the 8th, the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Again, I don't know if we have, like, every state seems to have a different way of kind of doing execution. So we haven't quite clarified that standard. We, you know, you could see an incorporation case there at some point, but I think that's another thing that the court doesn't want to touch at this point.
Most states do lethal injection, right? But you can still be hanged or
Yep, or electrocution, or and they're finding problems a lot of times with that lethal injection where
The drugs aren't manufactured anymore.
right, or they lose their potency over time, and so you actually saw, I forget what state it was, but they kind of did a rash of these executions because essentially they had a window with the cocktail that they made and an inability to get more of it in terms of its manufacture. So at any rate, this is where we are today. We're at a position of selective incorporation, and really this is where some of the trickier questions would come from. You just have to be able to do that two-step process. Questions? All right, so we're going to go to freedom of religion cases, and there is a kind of a complexity here because the language of the amendment itself actually sets up a contradiction that most people don't see initially. When you read the whole amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise. And initially, you might not think of those two as contradictory, but the way the language is set up is it can put the government in a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenario. I guess the easiest way to illustrate it is to use a bit of an absurd example, and then we can kind of show you more realistically. So let's say there's a church that is on fire, right? And you would be using governmental services, the local fire, department that is funded by taxpayer dollars to go put the fire out. If I put the fire out using the local fire department funded by taxpayers, am I helping to establish a religion?
I wouldn't say so, because you do it no matter
So
what.
so hold on. So you're thinking eventually, is it indirect? Is it neutral? That kind of stuff. But it just, to kind of look at it in a black and white sense.
You're saving that.
I'm saving the church, right? Therefore, they can continue to function as a church. Am I helping to establish?
Yes.
And then we'll bring in well, wait a minute, it's in a second. If I let it burn, am I prohibiting the free exercise?
Because you're not allowing them.
Right. So now let's look at it where it's a little less ridiculous. And what about tax exemption? The federal government likes to encourage charitable organizations. So if you're UNICEF, if you're the Red Cross, if you're any one of these entities that raises money for health, cancer research or something like that, you're going to get a tax exempt status, and therefore that encourages that charitable organization. Do religious entities provide charity?
Yes.
All right. So religions tend to be tax exempt as they do that charitable stuff. The power to tax also is the power to destroy. Could I use the power to tax to basically get rid of a religion I don't like? Okay, so they're tax exempt. That's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I give them tax exemption, I am helping establish at the expense of the government. If I tax them and use it in an aggressive manner, I'm prohibiting free exercise. So we've got to come up with what you were doing, which is wait a minute, what is this really? Is it really directly helping them? Is it really something unique to religion? So you were going right where the courts go with this question. And it starts with Everson versus the Board of Education. What you have is, we're in New Jersey, and they just basically had almost like a voucher system for transportation. Parents choose different kind of schools, public, private, parochial. What does parochial mean? Religious, right? And they all need to get to those schools. So what we're going to do to simplify things is essentially give you a travel voucher to get to where you need to go. Okay. Am I using taxpayer dollars to kind of give you this voucher to get you to a religious school? And therefore, am I helping establish? If I don't give you that voucher, am I prohibiting free exercise? We've got to begin to sort this out. And what they did, we're going to really look at, in general, and I kind of skip past this, if the government is going to kind of step on toes, they would rather step on the toes of prohibiting free exercise rather than put their stamp of approval on a particular religion. They are really wary of establishing. That seems to be the greater of the two evils, right? So the first series of cases we're going to look at are establishment cases.
Yeah, I feel like that could go wrong very quickly. Like you could put, like when a church is forming, like you could put like, this is the government stamp of approval, we're going to help this church, and then it turns out to be something terrible.
Well, so just to give you an example, the most recent efforts to do a travel ban that specifically targeted Muslim countries. What's the problem with that? It's not a free exercise case. It's not saying that people coming into the country have a right to their religion, right? Because they're not citizens. What it is the government establishing one religion over the other, saying that this particular religion
It's not as welcome here.
Yeah, exactly. So again, the establishment one is that slippery slope that the founding fathers were really wary of because of all the religious warfare in Europe. That's in part why they came over, for their freedom of religion. And it wasn't really freedom of religion. It was just freedom from government oppression with their,
Freedom from Anglicanism.
Yes, and then the right to discriminate against others as you had been discriminated against. So kind of keep that historic context in mind. All right, Paul, to get to your standards, and this is really, you were good, you were right there. When we look at this case of providing transportation funds for kids or families that are sending their kids to religious schools, the first question we ask is it indirect? Who's the money going to? Is it going to, am I giving religious organizations a check?
No.
No, I'm giving it to the parents, right? And they're going to use it to provide transportation to go to that religious school. So it is indirect. Is it available to all?
Yes.
Yeah. Again, regardless of what school you're going to, you get a transportation voucher. Is it religiously neutral?
Yes, it is.
This is the tricky standard that they're going to have to zero in a little bit more. We're going to do that in Lemon versus Kurtzman. You're saying yes, it is. Why?
Because it's not really telling you what religious school you have to go
Good.
to, or even if you're going to a religious
Yeah.
school at all.
So, this is kind of tricky because in part what I'm trying to think about in terms of neutral is, does it promote a particular religion over the other? But also, is it advancing or inhibiting a religion? Does this help a religion? Is it fostering their religious mission? Well, unless there's mandatory kind of Bible songs on the bus, or the bus driver is using the intercom to read Bible verses, it just seems like transportation, right? It really, you have to think about it this way. Would you not send a police officer to someone's home because you felt like, well, they're of a particular religion and I'm fostering that religion? You have to start looking at transportation the same as you would police, fire, other basic services. And in that sense, it's neutral, okay? So it doesn't go directly to the church. It is available to all, and yes, when you kind of think of it as police and fire, it's religiously neutral, right? So we kind of clarified it, but we really haven't. We're going to come back to that neutral standard in a little bit. Let's go to Engel versus Vitale next. What this is we're in New York, and every day they start off with a non-denominational prayer. Anybody know? Non-denominational. What does that mean, Colin?
Like it doesn't focus on one, like
Yeah, it could be in almost any church, in any synagogue, any kind of house of worship. It's not specific to a particular religious group or entity, right? It's this kind of more universal prayer. Almighty God. It doesn't say which God. I assume a monotheistic one, but I don't know. It could be Vishnu or one of the polytheistic gods. It could be Zeus. We acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. So here's this non-denominational prayer. It is also non-compulsory.
Doesn't tell you to do anything.
You don't, it's not directing you to do anything, but if I'm saying, okay, we're doing the prayer, but it's non-compulsory, what does it give you a right to do?
You don't have to do it.
You don't have to say it. You can just sit there and feel awkward, right? While the rest of us say it and judge. Okay? So it's non-denominational. Is this a violation of the Establishment Clause? Short and fast answer, yes.
What?
Because, now this is,
church and state.
this is a different thing. This is not about, again, would I use that Everson standard? Well, does it work? Does it work to kind of think, is this available? Is this, something that is neutral and available to all? And that standard doesn't work here, right? We basically are looking at, did the government cross a line with this? And yes, they're going to use what's called the high wall of separation. Go back to the founders, and essentially we're going to say we have a segregation of church and state. This public schools are part of a governmental public entity, and you have crossed the line into fostering a religion. No good.
Couldn't you then say the same thing about the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, and you'll see challenges for that reason. So you're going to get into that tricky slope, because is it on the back of our money? In God we trust. Do legislative sessions often start with a prayer? Yes. Does it work its way into graduations? Yes. Do we often talk about the Bible within classes? Yes. So they have to constantly, you need one, a challenge. You need two, the court to kind of take a look at it and clarify each specific instance. And then you need the implementing population to care. So in other words, I know there's this rule and I have to uphold it, as opposed to we're going to do it anyways and wait for another challenge.
Quick question about the pledge.
Yeah.
Because this just happened in one of my classes the other day.
Right.
So I know you can't be forced to say the pledge.
Right.
But can a teacher force you to stand?
I would put it this way. Would you go into a synagogue and not put on a yarmulke?
Okay.
And it has more to do with your being considerate of others during their religious ceremony, right? So I often look at it that way. You don't have to say the words, but a courtesy would be to understand that for a lot of people this is about, maybe they have military members in their
teacher
family.
got very upset.
So I would look at it that way. You wouldn't, like, if you're in a Catholic church and everybody's standing and kneeling, you wouldn't kind of, you may not go up and take communion because you feel that way. But I think rather than look at it as a legal issue, I would look at it as what would be considerate? What's the courtesy? Does this, am I making a principled stand based on principled beliefs, or am I just?
I think it also depends on if you're intentionally or if you're just sitting being respectful about it. I feel like
Right.
the way you're
There's a different approach.
Yeah, like the few times I've gone to church, I always get kind of uncomfortable because everyone is so strongly believing in it. But then my parents always just tell me they're not forcing you to believe anything.
Yeah.
It's just have courtesy and
It's a
stand
courtesy.
up when you're told to stand up.
Right. You still can put your
You
brain
don't
wherever
have
you want
to-
it.
You don't have to believe in anything, or you can think about it whatever you want to do.
Right. All right, let me, I have it timed so that I can get through each chunk. So again, I like to look at the language sometimes because it really does kind of clarify what they mean. A prayer composed by governmental officials as part of a governmental program to further religious belief. When you read it that way, it's like, oh yeah, that breaches the constitutional wall of separation between church and state. And this gets back to the founders that we were talking about. This very practice was one of the reasons that caused early colonists to leave England and seek, in quotes, I put it in quotes, religious freedom in America. The fact that it's non-compulsory doesn't mean that the ceremony's still going on. And there still is this impetus, this pressure to worship, because you are essentially being singled out as one that's not doing it, right? What's complicated though? Abington School District versus Shell. Now, what we're doing this time is we're reading the Bible. Different? Yeah, possibly, even though the prayer may have been inspired by the Bible, we're reading kind of Bible versions, 10 of them, in fact, at the beginning of school with no comment, so maybe that makes it okay. We're not saying anything about it. Hold on. So, and in addition, it's non-compulsory. You can be exempt, this time by like sending you outside the room. So, where are my atheist agnostics, kind of, weirdos outside, right? If you're something different.
You God-hating heathens,
yes, because
step outside.
different is bad, go ahead outside. So again, you gotta think about, is there an impetus there by kind of like identifying you as different, sending you out while the reading kind of continues. What's interesting is the challenger is a Unitarian, and initially he feels like this is a violation of his free exercise rights. Unitarians feel like the Bible is something figurative, not literal, and when you read it in this fashion without comment, it encourages a literal kind of interpretation. And basically his lawyers are like, you're better off with a violation of establishment
Like
kind of case.
you've got the right,
He's
you
okay
have,
with
you
reading.
have an argument, but you're doing it wrong.
Yes, he's maybe okay with reading the Bible, but it's like you have to teach it as a lesson, and this is figurative. Eventually what he's convinced of is maybe it has no place and this is more a violation of establishment. What's interesting is he wins the first case and then the school district appeals, and that's why we've flipped. Remember, it goes plaintiff defendant?
Right.
So at any rate, we're gonna look at the case and we're gonna kind of come up with a new standard. Because here's, and this is like spot on. I wasn't able to explain this until I had emoticons. What we're going to come up with is like a further clarification of neutral. Is this neutral? In a lot of cases, we teach the Bible, right? Why?
It's part of history.
It's a part of history. There are people that believe in this religion and that they shaped, and the religion shaped history. Is it literature?
Yeah.
Do you have to know, like, the prodigal son returns? Is it like a lot of our language comes from the Bible? So there might be a valid reason for teaching this. Ultimately though, is it neutral? The standard essentially is going to say neutral means not smiley faced emoticon, not frowny face emoticon, just straight line faced emoticon. I don't know if that has a name, right? It has to neither advance nor inhibit religion. And when I look at that as a standard, is it advancing religion to do 10 Bible verses? Yeah. If you're outside in the hallway, is the ceremony still going on? Yeah. Does it contain an impetus to worship? I would say so. So, in this case, we're going to strike it down. We're going to say, we're going to come up with that idea of it's not neutral. The problem is we've got to keep defining neutrality. So here we have a case of state aid to so you go to religious school. Do you learn math there?
Yeah.
Do you learn English? Do you learn science?
Maybe.
Right? Should funding go to the parochial school for the salaries of the teachers teaching secular, meaning kind of earthly, worldly subjects? All right, so let's put that neutrality standard in the standards that we've established in Everson kind of to a test. Does the teaching have a secular purpose? Yeah. Okay. Does it advance or inhibit religion to be teaching math?
No. But you could argue that by teaching them in a religious school, you're further educating them to express their religion.
Maybe, right? So in part I'm teaching that math in the context of the religious school, which has a religious mission, right? It may be a little indirect, but you can kind of see that we get there. How do I know that I'm not doing that I'm not fostering it? You would need a monitor in there to make sure that we're not doing math by saying 2 giraffes plus 2 elephants plus 2 zebras, right?
Equals 1 ark.
Equals, minus, the population of sinners.
Add 1 million gallons of water.
Right. So could I, you would have to have a monitor in there making sure that it is not wrapped up in that religious mission, what you're doing. Okay, so real quickly, just to kind of get me to where I wanted to, Tate, it's exactly what you kind of talked about. That this is too complex because it's involving excessive entanglement. Look real quick. I don't know if we've clarified anything, because this is kind of what's happened over the years. Some things are okay, some things aren't, right? We'll come back to this tomorrow, especially in the warm-up. We're gonna do freedom of, free exercise cases as well.